I appreciate offering some of my thoughts on reducing off-flavors in plant protein isolates. It certainly is a very hot topic, if we want to call it that today. The idea of substituting plant proteins for animal proteins. And so I'll give you a little bit of background for the presentation. We've done work on pea proteins and pennycress as well as camelina. Certainly, we're looking at a pulse organization, and so that's of interest to the pea. But I also want to talk about pennycress because we've gotten some good research that's really useful and I think applicable to when we start looking at off-flavors in pea protein. And of course, the idea is we look at this and how can we get rid of some of these off-flavors? What's done in other products, other plants, and so kind of put them together to make some progress on pea specifically. And again, soy has been in a position of representing plants as a whole for many years. There's a lot of data on soy proteins, off-flavors. But again, there's a difference between plants. Some plants have certain compounds. Other plants have, unique compounds also. And so soy doesn't have all the solutions we need if we start looking at pulses. They're just different groups, different families. And so let's take whatever we've done in the past and see if we can't put it to work for us in solving, like I say, some of our problems in terms of pulse proteins. There is a lot of interest, I think, as I look around on the literature, what's kind of a major player, a major focus these days. Pea protein is certainly in that category. It is a legume like soy, but it's not as problematic in terms of off-flavors. Soy is a really recognized off-flavor. It's very clear. Pea isn't quite as dramatic. It isn't quite as obvious, but it still needs to be looked at or certainly addressed. And like I say, I'm going to talk about some other crops that we don't fit in this grouping simply because we've learned some things from it, things that we can reproduce or at least try on pea protein isolates. And so I am going to say a little bit about pennycress, not really much about camelina. They're very, very similar crops. So I'll stick primarily to pennycress. If you're not familiar with pennycress, it is from the brassica family. I shorten that a little bit, which includes cabbage, mustard, horseradish, other vegetables. And you kind of look at that mustard, horseradish, I can see a problem with this. And so it brings different groups of chemicals. It brings some interest and some solutions, I think, that we can apply to the pea protein. These oil crops, pennycress, camelina, they are oil crops. And so like soy, they get planted, harvested, income from the oil itself. But they're also high in protein, just like soy. So they are interesting materials for us. There's no question. And like I say, a good deal of work that's done on them. And so let's kind of take a look at some of the past work that we've done, particularly on soy protein isolates. There are two primary methods of preparing an isolate. One is called an alkali solubilization, and the other salt solubilization. So kind of two major differences or different approaches to preparing protein isolates. They basically, both methods do or work in the same manner. We take something like a pea flour, we dissolve it as best we can in water. We then can, in the alkaline approach, change the pH so the protein precipitates. The things we don't necessarily want stay in solution or float at the top, for oil, for example. And so we can separate them, our kind of water-soluble, other components, lipids included, and take them off, take that protein precipitate, change the pH again, so we solubilize it, bring it back into solution, and again, precipitate. So it's kind of precipitating and solubilizing, getting rid of impurities in between. And so for the work that we did in the past here, we basically looked at both the alkaline process of solubilizing, making the protein isolates, and a salt solubilization, because you can change the salt concentration and salt into solution or salt out of solution. So kind of equivalent to pH adjustment, but same process, precipitate, throw away, or at least get rid of the liquid portion, resolubilize the protein, and so on. So we spent a fair amount of time looking at the two different processes of making a protein isolate and looking at them from an off-flavor standpoint. I make note of the different steps at which we've actually done studies on, or looking at off-flavors or volatile compounds. And if we look at P, this is an aroma extract run on a gas chromatograph, looking at the aroma compounds in P. P protein isolates. Well, we'll find there's a pretty good number of them that could come along with the protein isolates. This is numbered 1 through 12. And these compounds that have the red numbers, they're actually the ones that are the most potent. They have the strongest odor and therefore are most important to get rid of. It's always interesting that some of these peaks down here, if we look down here at 3, 4, 5, that's just compound number 3, 4, or 5, tiny peaks, and they may be as potent or more potent than this component over here at 10. So again, we're interested in getting a profile of the volatiles in the plant, identifying them, and then saying, okay, what chemical groups are these? What compounds are these? How do we get rid of them? How do we get them out of that particular profile? Because they are the ones that are causing us an objectionable character. And so we went through that for both a salt extracted process, so soy protein, not soy, pea protein isolate, and then a pH extracted product. So two different methodologies. And it probably isn't a surprise that when we look at the final protein isolates, the common objectionable components are common to both the salt extracted and the pH extracted. There's not a great deal of difference in the sensory character between going through the salt extraction process or the pH extraction process. Talk about pennycress a little later. And for pennycress, there is just a real major difference in the off flavors, the contaminating flavors for a salt extract versus a pH. For P, they're really pretty similar. I've highlighted in red what the most important components are, and by that I mean most potent. And they're pretty much common between, like I say, the two processes. The red ones here are largely aldehydes. There is an acid over here if we go over this direction, but they tend to be carbonyl compounds. And so they are difficult to get rid of, but there are ways to do it. And so I'll come to that in a bit. Things like methionyl, 1-octane-3-ol, methoxypyrazine, they're recognizable. You could pick them up on analysis, but they're not as dominant as the aldehydes are. So we're really interested in those aldehydes and how we remove them from our particular process. And so just kind of a little bit of summary in terms of that pea protein isolate. We have identified the compounds that are problematic to us, that helps us key on mechanisms or ways to get rid of them. Where do they come from? Why are they there? Well, most are lipid oxidation products. And so those lipid oxidation products, they tend to come along with the protein isolation. So your off notes generated through lipid oxidation, primarily, not entirely, but primarily. And like I say, they tend to be carried along, whether we're doing salt or a pH-based extraction. And so let's kind of look at some other plants and saying, okay, we've done something on peas. Can we learn from other approaches, other plant materials? And to that end, we've been studying pennycress and camelina, for that matter, both of them. There's a publication that's probably in print at this point. I don't know if it's available in the Journal of Ag and Food Chemistry, and that's particularly on pennycress. So let me spend a little bit of time about pennycress and what that makes me think about when we talk about pea proteins. Pennycress is an oil crop, which you know. It's a good source of cooking oils and also, like I say, a good source of protein. It is from the Brassica family. It's known for sulfur-containing compounds. And I put bad there because they really are pretty potent. You need to get rid of them one way or another. And so we took a look at protein isolates from pennycress seeds, kind of in the same way. We again went through the idea of making protein isolates by the two different methods, salt or acid-based precipitation, and then started looking at, as we go through the process, what is still left? How did these, if we lose volatiles, what are the mechanisms? What are they lost for? Or, well, lost because of, I suppose, a better way to put it. If you go back and you look at any of these processes to make protein isolates, none of them have a step in there to get rid of volatile compounds. They all focus on keeping the protein, cleaning up the protein. None of the steps really are focused on, like you say, getting rid of off-flavors. And so the pennycress is very much the same in the sense. There are a couple, 2-3 steps of solubilizing, precipitating. We had both salt-based isolation, finishing with ultrafiltration and dialysis, which could have some implication in terms of getting rid of off-flavors. And the same with the acid-based precipitation, isolation process finishes with dialysis. That's kind of rather relevant, this final step. For this work, one of the problems we always run into when we start talking about flavor and methods and analytical approaches, everybody has their favorite. The analytical chemists have their favorite. And these are some of the approaches that are used to try to get a good analytical look at the off-flavor components. So these are isolation techniques. And there's SPME, which is solid phase microextraction. This fiber, it's like a syringe needle fiber, can be put in the headspace above the ground plant tissue, just to calculate, or I should say accumulate, volatiles, flavor compounds from the headspace. Or it can actually be immersed in the liquid. So we take the plant, grind it up in water, and stick this fiber, absorbent fiber, into the liquid. Two different approaches. There's a method called purge and trap. It has some real advantages, but historically there's been problems with it foaming. Purge and trap, you bubble an inert gas through your sample of protein and water. So you're bubbling. The volatiles go in, flavor compounds go into those bubbles, they get carried out. Well, you pass that stream of inert gas through an absorption chamber. And so with the stir bar also, we tend to absorb volatile compounds onto this membrane and then heat it up drive off volatiles into gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. And there's typically a sniffing step in there. Someone's sitting at the end of a gas chromatograph, a mass spectrometer, smelling each component as it elutes, been separated as it elutes off the column, and saying, oh, this is potent, this smells like. So there's instrumental and there's also human. For our work and what I'll talk about today, we really chose the purge and trap. It spent about 4 months looking at these different methodologies and saying what gives us the best results. So anyway, that's where we always start. In terms of the off-flavor components, doing our purge and trap, have sensory people, they identified 42 components with a significant odor. In other words, people smelling at the end of the gas chromatograph said, I smell it, and it has this character. And what they really found were sulfur compounds. Thiocyanates, isothiocyanates, think of your mustard horseradish. You don't want them. If you're going to try and produce a protein isolate, you want none of them present. But we'll talk about these a little bit more, even though they're not present really in pea. It's of interest and relevant. So the key components, most importantly, sulfur compounds, but like pea, aldehydes are also present, and they tend to be objectionable. Alcohols usually aren't a problem. There's maybe some miscellaneous things, but really what we look at most at with pea is certainly the aldehydes, the carbonyl compounds. Now, we could spend a lot of time digesting this one, but we're not going to do it, and I suppose I should have just left some off. But in this case, we were looking at the pennycress protein isolates, and this is the salt extract, this is the alkaline extract. And what we have here is we have the quantity of classes of compounds present in each of these protein isolates. For example, if we look at identification of alcohols, we really only found some trace amounts of alcohols in our salt extracted one. Not particularly important, but aldehydes we come across, that's a lot of material. So we found a lot of aldehydes in our pennycress. But we go down to these other things like ketones, are very offensive, sidates, nitriles, sulfides. Whatever this process did, it got rid of them. They went away. They were no longer in these protein isolates. And so whatever we did in processing this pennycress, it got rid of some very, very objectionable notes. We would like to have seen it get rid of aldehydes, and it didn't. And so that's still a catch. We've got these aldehydes to look at. But from this work, we learned a great deal about what methods get rid of what classes or groups of flavor components. And we kind of look at this, and as I said before, there's really no steps included in these protein isolates that we expect would reduce volatiles. Basically, you're trying to get rid of other water-soluble things, typically, whether it's primarily carbohydrates that we want to get rid of, but we want a protein isolate, but there's no steps. So how did we get rid of them? How do we get rid of those other things and still leave the protein? And so this is where I'm kind of going now, is thinking about this on a broader sense. Where are the off-flavors? How are they held there? How do we get rid of them? How do we get them out of here? So that's kind of the direction I want to be going at this point. And I title this Overview of Reservoirs. In other words, safe havens for undesirable flavor compounds. And so we don't want any reservoirs for off-flavors. We want them to go away with the water, go away with the manufacturing liquid. And so we're going to kind of look at where are off-flavor components, what part of the plant, what's keeping them there, how do we get rid of them? And so for our P's, off flavor, probably comes about from enzymatic activity, as I said, and that brings in primarily carbonyl compounds. So we're generating these materials, and we're generating generally from lipid. So we're doing enzymatic, or the plant is doing enzymatic degradation of the lipid of the plant, giving us off flavors. So these off flavors, where do they go? Well, every product would have some headspace, sure, but this is minor. We do have this protein that we're carrying along, we're isolating. Well, will flavors react with protein? Sure they will. If they react with protein, they don't make a sensory contribution. So I'm interested in reacting flavors with proteins. When we make a protein isolate, we're extracting the protein, and we do that extract in an aqueous system. So our extracting medium is we extract the proteins out with water. So here's our water extract. We'll do this 3-4 times. We have the curse, I'll say, of basically pea protein having some protein-bound lipid. And I say free lipid. Yes, there's free lipid. You can extract that. And boy, you want that done, because any residual lipid is going to be a source of off flavors. But it's this weakly bound lipid. So it's weakly bound to protein. That's the real challenge, because we can squeeze lipid out, we can extract lipid out, but that great reservoir lipid, unfortunately, we can't get rid of because it's protein bound. So that's really what we're most interested in here, is looking at this lipid that's binding some of our flavor compounds that we can't readily get to. So let's kind of look at each of these different places our plant protein off flavors may be. In the lipid, in the protein, in the headspace, in the, wherever. If we look at the sample headspace, and by that's, aroma above the plant tissue, something that goes into the gas phase. And so do we really lose a significant amount of off flavors due to evaporation? Not really. And so going into the headspace, that's, but like I say, that's too little. It's really too little to be significant to us. But when I start thinking about that, these things are volatile. There are flavor compounds, aroma compounds. They are volatile. They will go into the headspace if we provide it. And if we, let's say, do a little extra work with it, that I'll explain. We typically change water, extract by aqueous systems, and we tend to throw away the water that we use to extract out all these protein contaminants, I'll call them, the carbohydrates. But let's also think about if it's a way to also extract volatile compounds. And so why do we use membranes? Why don't we use evaporators? We use evaporators in the food industry all the time. So how about treating our protein isolate with water as we're making it? And instead of using membranes that don't really evaporate flavor compounds, let's look at evaporation, simple distillation. We can remove the water and re-extract again and keep on doing this. So we're washing it. And so evaporation is one thing that we want to look at. So instead of taking water out of the system as we're making this isolate, again, hydrate, not distill, but so we go ahead, hydrate our system, and we extract the water one way or another. And so, like I say, we're going to look at taking water out by evaporation, not membranes. We look about protein reactions is certainly another issue. Whoops, went the wrong direction. We're going to use lipid. Okay, so headspace, yes. But again, look at that. How about this lipid, residual lipid? How does that enter in? Well, most of our flavor compounds are soluble in lipids. So any residual lipid we leave is going to be a problem. It's going to be a reservoir. It's going to hang on to those volatile compounds, and they will give it up, and you will sense them. So we want to get the lipid out as absolutely best we can. In this particular class of plant tissues, there's also some protein-bound lipid. So we can get rid of free lipid by a solvent extract. We don't necessarily get rid of the protein-bound lipid, and that is something that we kind of have to live with or have to deal with. If we could get rid of those protein-bound lipids, that would really help us in not providing a safe haven to bring off-flavors to us during processing. Let me take a look at this, where I was going. Well, this, we should be looking at, and I hope everybody is looking at soy, because I really like some of the work that's been done along these lines. This protein-bound lipid, very difficult to remove, as I mentioned. Okay, Darmadan and Aurora actually patented a process using cyclodextrins. So the cyclodextrins could take these aromas away from the protein-bound lipids and be moved from the system. So really a good patent, in my opinion, right on track. So we've got our lipid there. We have a reaction with proteins. Yes, flavors will react with proteins. If they react with proteins or other food constituents, they may not be volatile, so you may not sense them. And we've spent a fair amount of time looking at covalent reactions by proteins. And so we've got a pretty good appreciation for how flavor compounds will react with these proteins. We have mass spectral data, putting some flavor compound together with a protein and saying, what happens? We've got some carbon-14 data. This has been published. This hasn't been published, but it's been done. And so kind of looking at the particular systems here, these flavor protein reactions go well under alkaline conditions. And wouldn't you know, our isolation procedure uses pH as high as 12. That favors the reaction. So high pH and temperature, for that matter, favor the reaction of off flavors with your proteins to reduce off notes. I think I covered the keys there. And this is just, I think we got 2 or 3 slides showing how flavors react with proteins. This happens to be beta-lactoglobulin, and this is the mass spectrum of pure beta-lactoglobulin. And this is with 1 lactose on it or 2 lactoses. So there's lactose and beta-lactoglobulin. We put allyl isothiocyanate with our beta-lactoglobulin. Then we looked at our protein. And look at the difference. Every time there's another new line, that's protein, beta-lactoglobulin, reacted with isothiocyanate. So again, nice reaction. That's cleaning up. That's getting rid of our isothiocyanates, bonding here where they're not volatile and they can't be smelled. Another example is looking at an aldehyde citral. As I said, in P, you really won't have any isothiocyanates, but you will have aldehydes, and this is just showing data of an aldehyde reacting with protein. So aldehydic off notes, off aromas. Here's our protein again, and you can see here's where we bonded 1, 2, 3, 4 different citral molecules onto that protein molecule. So again, we can actually do some bonding. We can do some cleaning up by favoring protein flavor molecules. And again, we've had some papers published on this already. We have two manuscripts with C14 labeling, basically show data by C14 labeling or MS data that give us some information about how we can bind off notes to proteins to clean them up, to get rid of some off notes. This is just some of the C14 data. I think I've got maybe 1 slide or 2. And here's our allyl isothiocyanate reacting with our protein isolate. And that reaction is extremely fast for the isothiocyanate. But it's just like a vacuum cleaner. We're going to set that up off flavor. So that's isothiocyanate. here's an aldehyde, 2-undecadone. Whoops, that's a ketone. So here's a decanal is the one I want. Yep, I'll be okay. So here's our decanal that's reacting with our protein. And we see that's also being consumed by the protein, binding by the protein. So both of these processes really have a way of reducing the amount of free volatile compounds. And so the idea of using protein to scavenge off flavors is not unreasonable. So that kind of talks about lipid. It talks about reaction with proteins, talk about headspace, where we might use evaporation instead. How about our extracting medium? When we're going ahead and making our protein isolates, they're done in an aqueous system. pH is adjusted. The protein isolates maintained. We toss out our aqueous medium, our extracting medium. And so the interest here is looking at, whoops, went the wrong direction. How can we change this extracting medium to better remove off flavors, draw them away from our system, away from our sensory perception? And so kind of this idea starts looking at what solvents to use in making protein isolates. Is there anything we can do to improve solubility of these off notes in our extracting solvents? What's the effect of salt on flavor compound solubility in water, concentration of salt? Co-solvents, should we put a little bit of ethanol in the water that we use to make protein isolates? So again, how do we improve our solvents used making protein isolate to take along off flavors with them? And in some cases, we may be working with the solvent. Let's change that solvent a little bit so we still isolate our protein, but we bring along and toss, actually, we throw out these other solvents that are put in. We should look at the state of the protein. How do we alter, how do we weaken protein binding sites? Hydrophobic regions in proteins is what I'm thinking of. So our hydrophobic regions in proteins are also just great sites for flavor to find refuge. And so again, let's extract what we can. Let's not give the proteins a place to hide. So those lipids, or for that matter, even protein. And some literature exists along these lines, but again, can we do more? Can we think about using them differently? And this is kind of a foolish example, foolish in the sense it's trivial. So this is a protein, so your pink, I'll call it pink. Protein, forms a configuration, so it has nice hydrophobic pockets here and here. Here's where off flavors go, so they're kind of protected. When we move our protein, isolate our protein, it takes these off notes with us. And so when I say, can we change that protein so they don't carry these off notes with it? And the silly part, what I found in the literature was a nice picture using sodium dodecyl sulfate. And what does it do to the protein? Completely eliminates these pockets. And it makes them into a linear chain. Now, that wouldn't be desirable. So this isn't the idea of edible in a perfect idea. But it's illustrating the approach. If we can look at food components, edible components, that will straighten out these proteins, get rid of these hydrophobic pockets, our flavors are going to be out there. They're going to be out in the solution. They're going to have to go someplace. Why not go along with the extracting medium? And so I think this idea of trying to change the protein and the hydrophobicity of the protein, at least in product separation, I think it has merit. It's something we should be looking at. So it's kind of as a summarizing, we're getting to that point. Learning what have we learned, future work, understanding the retention, loss of flavor compounds during protein isolation. Let's try to have them go along with the liquid that's used in making the protein isolate. Maybe we get rid of that liquid, that aqueous phase, by evaporation. Let's take a look if we can do anything to extract or reduce these compounds than binding to the protein. Weaken the binding sites, so off-flavor components are extracted along in manufacturing. That may change the protein. That sodium dodecyl sulfate in the last slide certainly changes the protein functionality. So can we weaken our protein isolate, our sites there, so that they really are still functional, but they also favor volatile isolation? So we've got something we can do here. Data on causing a change, looking at flavor release. So again, can we change the proteins, ever so mild changes, and still find that they do the functionality we want, but they just aren't as good at attracting and protecting volatiles? We've got a number of things we can look at that can influence protein solubility, protein binding, pH, heat denaturation, salts, partial hydrolysis, and of course the idea of having an evaporator. So use aqueous system and evaporate them instead. So we evaporate our volatiles rather than keep them. So there's a lot of opportunities. I think we have a good deal of choices on where to go with this. And it's rather exciting. So anyway, it's something we enjoy. Look forward to chatting with anybody if the proposition comes up. So anyway.